September 914. Young Finan was curled up in the crook of Osrith's arm when Sainid hammered on her chamber door. She would have to put a stop to his talking at night, which had begun with Osrith telling him a story about their ancestor, Oswald, and her son telling her three, the last being Saint Cuthbert's story, of the salmon and the eagle. Edra has been taking him to Culdees every day, and every story was an opportunity for the boy to remember it. The first time she remembered young Finan doing this, he had told of King Edwin and the visitation of the priest, when he was in exile and sent of an angel telling him of the Christian faith. She had remembered young Finan quieting Constantine's banqueting hall as her son recited the tale, and, to Osith's amazement, how the room had fell still, watchful, as he told the story out loud and clear. A truce Gileash, she had thought, as her mind had drifted to Sula and the woman's declaration. But because Osrith had not stopped him talking the previous night, his mind had become too animated for sleep, and he had then got overtired, and Osrith had promised to make sure young Finan did not talk the next night. She rolled her son over so she could make her arm escape, wondering how it was so many mothers found it easy to parent their children, or at least seemed to make it easy, when it felt so hard for her. It had taken a year before Osrith regained her strength. Training and the feel of her sword, and drill practice with the sons of the Mormers from all over Alba, and the muscle memory in her hands soon recalled Buie and Tagd's sword as she taught sword skill with Sainid beside her. It had begun slowly, and had built up her strength. Now, Constantine had called her to him, having heard from Osrith of her acceptance of Sainid's proposal and wished to resume being a warrior, and told her that she was to begin by training the sons of the Lormers. It was a good role, one she had spent years doing, in Wessex, in Mercia. Little brattlings full of ideas and who knew everything. Off you go, young children, go on, untrained, if you know everything, seeing as you know everything. Watch your Norseman's axe go through your friend's skull, yours next. Sainid hammered again. The birds had not even woken, and nor had Osrith. Enough, but he was persistent. Osrith, that got her up, and she carried young Finan through to Edra's room and nestled him beside her, pulling on her jerkin over her shirt. Her breeches were halfway up when Sainid pulled open the door and stood in the doorway, leaning on the wall, grinning. Two more arrived last night, snotty-nosed little curs. Two more? The sons of Cat, in the far north, and south of it, Moirab, arrived last night, Sainid told her, watching her dress. Osrith stopped pulling on her clothes, and paced over to him. Sainid's sharp eyes looked at her animated face, and he pointed his head in her direction. Osrith stretched past him to pull down her sword belt, which Sainid took from her and wrapped around her hips. Their hands touched for a moment, and Osrith wrapped her fingers around his. His bright eyes met hers, and drew up her hand, kissing the back of it. Selark is already up, and rousing the buggers, Sainid told her. You have a handful there. I have had worse, I am sure, Osrith told him. To train the young, that was where she needed to start. To get used to swordcraft again, and teach herself as well as the future of Alba in the form of its young men from Pitland and Dulriata. And indeed he was down, with 5 boys beside him. Above them, Finan Beeg was watching the courtyard, at the warriors assembling, which he had done nearly every day of his life, except with his mother next to him, not his big sister. When young Finan saw his mother, he began to wave and shouting down to her. Edra shushed him, and told him that if he was going to do that, she would take him away. May I introduce your captain? Sainid told the boys. All 5 of them were solemn, silent, but Osrith's long experience told her that this usually meant trouble. And when she had called them forward, she found trouble, in the forms of Dubcan, son of Dubcan, Mormor of Angus, and Darak, son of Drostan of Charag. Osrith gripped Buie, feeling the memory of the last week coming back to her, as Eswi, Phelim and Angus had trained her strength back into her. It was coming back to her, the feel of her sword in her hand, the placement of Tagd's seeks at her hip, how to double back and stab forward with it, at the back of the knee, in the groin, under the armpit. Osrith knew she was slower than she had been and had made mistakes. Eswi told her to forgive herself, and it would come in time. It had. He also asked her about the marriage proposal. Constantine told us and his, Ormuz, he told Osrith, taking her to one side, and they had walked beside the fourth. You are going to marry? Yes, Osrith agreed. And none is more surprised than I never thought I would marry. And Sainid? I have known him forever. He will provide a home for me and for young Finan. And? She had broken off when she saw the look of doubt in Eswi's eyes. I trust him, Osrith told him. He will take care of young Finan. His father is lost to me. Eswi had said nothing, and they had continued training. How could it be different, though? Osrith had thought. How could Eswi doubt her motivations when Osrith had made a promise to Finan that he would never keep? Now, a prickle of the memory came back to Osrith as she spied Eswi next to young Finan in the room above. He called down to his mother, but Osrith did not look up. It must be strange for him, she thought, for it was usually Osrith and young Finan watching everyone in the courtyard training. In front of her, two boys stood. They were not of the usual young boys. These were the curs who had arrived the night before and had upset Sainid's sleeping arrangements. And that gave Osrith an idea about these youngsters' attitudes. If Sainid, the most placid man in the country, had been put out. Come, she beckoned to the two boys, who were hovering near their fathers. Come, show me your weapons. Neither moved, although Dobkin pushed his son away from him. Young Dobkin took a few involuntary steps forward, then stopped, and glowered at Osrith. So, you are Constantine's Sahor? He asked, his weapon out for her to examine it. A gasp came from around the courtyard. Close your mouth now, Osrith thought, as she raised Bu'e, of it will be worse for you. Behind him, Dobkin, Mormor of Angus, took a step and hit his son hard around the head, looking embarrassed. But it did not deter young Dobkin, and he swaggered towards Osrith, the bare skin draped around his shoulders. I heard that the king's father, and at this young Dobkin looked to Constantine and nodded an acknowledgement, captured you and gave you to his son. Young Dobkin looked up to young Finan, and you have been on your back, opening your legs, since. Too much trash talk, Osrith thought, as she put in an underthrust to young Dobkin's hand. The noble Pictish boy automatically dropped the weapon and he watched it in dismay as it skittered across the cobbles. He turned back to Osrith, outrage on his features, but she had already decided what she was going to do to disable him. She fell, and dropped her sword. Before her, young Dobkin would be swaggering, she knew, and bowed her head until she saw his boots beside her sword, which he then trod on. You see? He was boasting, no woman can, but Osrith was reaching for Tag's seeks as she leapt for his ankles. Young Dobkin fell to the dirt as she kicked his shins, and Osrith drew up the blade. She nearly had him, but he had managed to push her over. He swung a punch, which hit Osrith in the face, but at the angle he was swinging, young Dobkin had no power behind it. Osrith took up her blade and made to stab towards his chest, but then thrust herself to one side, feigning a stab to the back of his knees. Young Dobkin fell over once again, and Osrith was on her feet again, having looped Bu'e into her other hand. She stood over the young nobleman, both blades aimed into his torso. He looked up to her, then let his head sink back down in defeat. Yes, Osrith murmured as Dobkin crossed the courtyard towards his son. Yes, I am a Merchoyer there, a Kugless, a grey outsider. But I am the outsider who will show you how to fight the Say. Young Dobkin made to reach for his blade and Osrith let him. He tried to stab her but his blade passed over shoulder, missing any chance to harm her. Osrith stood back. Well, it hit me, Osrith mocked him as young Dobkin got to his feet. But I am not cut. Tell me, is your blade one that Comsil himself blessed? Around them, many in the crowd laughed as Osrith paced around him. And, as you like Comsil so much, here is. She stood on his chest. 3 prayers to our God on high. Osrith opened up her arms as Constantine's bishop did. Please give young Dobkin another chance, because he isn't really a Kushite after all. Cromjib knew about this, am I right? This earned much more laughter, and she stepped off young Dobkin's trust, waving her fingers around the handles of her blades as if to encourage the joke. She knew a little of Comsil, for she had listened to young Finan tell them to her night after night, and there were many useful moral tales to be known, or maybe that was the point with Comsil. I may be called many things, some of which are true, Osrith added, to the faint tinkle of a laugh around her, but you, Cushite, are an idiot. Dubkin crossed the stableyard and wrenched his sword from the floor. He glanced backwards to Osrith, said nothing. And you? The second princeling looked terrified as he looked across to Osrith, his arm shaking as he held a long-handled axe out to her. Name? Yuunst, of Dondhia, he stammered. You, but time for speaking over. Osrith made to swing her sword towards the shaft of the axe, but instead, her sword fell to her side. Come, at me, Osrith instructed. Yuunst looked to one side and the other, before raising his sword, and giving the loudest battle scream Osrith could imagine in such a slight child. She parried, and just about brought the sword around. He thrust into nothing, but turned back, and tried again. It took Osrith just a few minutes more to unsword the boy, making sure she treated him nobly, as he had treated her. Insults before battle were expected. Personal insults from princelings had crossed the line. So Osrith wanted everyone to see, the Mormers, Eswi, Constantine, even Edra, who would probably be watching with young Finan from his rooms, that respect begat respect. And he had learned on the third parry not to turn so late, that a swift double back was worth the effort, for Yuunst had nearly unbalanced her. Very good, she praised, when she got a blade cut to the back of her hand. She hadn't been quick enough and the boy had. The third and fourth boys had learned quickly they were here for a lesson, and not for foolish posturing, and they too gained some more to their skills. As midday came, Saynid came to collect the trainees. Osrith wiped her brow with the back of her hand, the one she had cut, which stung with the salts in her sweat. You did well, said Phelim, approaching her, grinning. Young Dubkin is an arrogant shite. We enjoyed how you put him in his place. Osrith turned to him. He learned something they all did. If he had spoken to me like that and we were not in training, however, his father would have been short of an heir. Kill him? Phelim asked, curiously. Cut his balls off, Osrith clarified. And his sword hand. That he could never work, nor father a child to support him in his old age. Brutal stuff, Phelim commented. But Osrith shook her head. I have a reputation to uphold. And I read what I can, when I can. That is the punishment that was meted out to failed gladiators. They were an insult to their emperor. That little bastard in waiting was insulting King Constantine. Through me, it would have been my duty. I hope that he learns the easy way, for his sake. It was the effort of the day making her talk like that, Osrith knew, but there was a kernel of truth in it. She had had a child, and she was not as strong as she had been. This meant her justice with respect to Constantine had to be infallible in order for these young boys, who would soon be men, to know her, and respect her. Nothing else mattered. I'm here because King Constantine wants to see you immediately, Phelim told her. Osrith got to her feet. She wondered why, but it didn't take long for her to find out. You are to go to Mercia, to Brunanburh again, Constantine told Osrith, as she stood before him. A quick glance from Eswi told her he was serious. You owe your time to Mercia. Begin there. I am told there is an influx of Norse heading down the Mearth in order to settle in the west of Northumbria. The lady is in need of assistance and, according to my treaty with her, she must have it. Lady, Osrith wanted to spit. Lady? But then, noticing Senid, standing beside his cousin, was watching her, it would be as well for their marriage to earn the years from the lady's service as quickly as possible. Phelim, Eswi and Angus would be with her, she supposed, and she would get the lie of the land from Elfrith and Miral. Brunanburh was the fortress already built, and a brief sting of sadness cut at her heart. This would be the first time she would be leaving young Finan. He would watch his mother ride away to war. Those thoughts in her head, Osrith stepped forward on cue as Constantine beckoned her to him, standing up and facing her, as if equals. Then, he bent his head to her ear. I want to know what is settled about the king of the Ophüic now Guthard is dead. Owain is to come with you. He stepped back, and Osrith did too, and for the first time she saw that, Beside Angus was the heir to the Strathclydian throne. Constantine, you think it wise? Words, the like of which she might utter in moments of intimacy while he lay beside her, came out of Osrith's mouth before she could stop them. She stood still, as the audible gasp from the direction of Constantine's warriors filled his throne room. But the king of Alba merely smiled, and held up a hand, nodding as a small whisper had begun in this now impromptu court. You care for the boy, I understand this, Constantine told her. And I have already lost Ildup. Is this wise, you ask? He got to his feet again. Osrith felt her heart move. It was the first time, to her knowledge, that he had mentioned his second son, who had drowned just over 2 years before. Constantine would have Edra's marriage alliance with Anlaf, and Selarch was his heir, Malcolm, Domnall's son, now next. But he wanted a united Alba, and to get that, he needed Owain to submit, or at least to bow in fealty. Once Strathclyde was Dyfnwal's no longer. And it was true, the boy did need battle experience. But really? Battle experience in Mercia, where his uncle Eadwulf, who had indeed yielded Gwynedd to Hywel and extinguished the house of Aberfraw, would desire him back, not least for ransom purposes. She had promised Anna she had plucked him from Nysinlai to sailed the long way back to Pitland, so precarious was his position in the top left-hand corner of Wales once his grandfather died. I tell you, warrior Osrith, and took her hand, holding it aloft with his own as if in victory. You are the person to whom I trust the most with my kingdom, whom I trust most with my descendants. Constantine declared to his warriors, to his household. This warrior, known as Cregicvin to the Norse, who had ties to both Mercia and Northumbria, he added, glancing to Osrith, is, I declare, the person in whose hands I trust with my cousin's kin, Owain. And then he let go of Osrith's hand, and with another, swung it open with an arc, towards the heir of Strathclyde. Owain mac Dyfnwal, he said, and it was only then that Osrith saw the man that the young boy she had taken from the Gwyned's holy isle had become. Tall, like his father Amd big, with the warm, fair hair of the Cymric, soft brown eyes that she remembered were so inquisitive as he watched the waves in their traverse north all those years ago. Those years before Finan had been born. Looking at him now, Osrith was saddened at the time she had missed, with the nobles of Alba, with the politics. Had she been a man, it would have been a woman who had given birth to young Finan. She would have been able to return to her role as warrior immediately after his birth, immediately after his conception, she supposed, while someone else did all the work. And she had missed out on so much, so many chances of command. So she would not miss out on this one. Osrith glanced at Constantine, who was still speaking, and attuned her ears to his words. With warriors Osrith, Felim, Angus, and Eswi, to Cester, to aid the Mersons. Lead the Mersons, Osrith told him, turning confidently towards her king. Constantine stopped talking, and did not protest at her interruption. I have command responsibilities in Mercia. She glanced to the Gaelish and Pictish warriors before her, and added, we have found a way to fight beside one another against the scourge of the Norse, and I am sure we will do so again. And then fell silent, for she was suddenly patently aware that, as well as Constantine's warriors nodding in agreement at her words, that beside Owain was Edra. She was betrothed to a Norse lord, Anlaf. She herself had both Norse and Danish blood. Edra could be offended at Osrith's description of her kin. But Edra was smiling, and this made Osrith smile more. Warrior Osrith, Owain said, still standing beside Constantine, and she noticed that a few brief gesticulations and nods had occurred between him and the warriors, Constantine and Sainid. She straightened her back, and looked at the king in waiting patiently, aware that she was still covered in dirt from battle training. Felim had insisted she go to Constantine immediately. Warrior Osrith, Owain repeated, and as he spoke, Osrith knew that if she had felt any hostility at all in mentoring Owain, it would have melted under his words, humble and honest, as he spoke as if to entreat her. I am in need of counsel, in both politics of our southern neighbor and in battle training. He glanced to Constantine, who nodded briefly as if encouraging the prince to speak on. "I would be honored to learn in your stead, as a warrior beside your other warriors, those of Pitland." He nodded to Phelim and Eswi, and the Gales. "To learn beside the Mersons as we hold off an invasion of our lands." He bowed his head. "To learn from my kin, daughter of Gwyddolth of House Arian of Rhst. Please grant me a position beside you, honorable warrior, that I may learn my skill." It took a few moments for Osrith to realize the hush in the throne room was because she was being waited on for an answer. She resisted the urge to nurse her head, to touch her forehead with her hand in wonder at where her wit was now. Osrith had changed, that much she knew, and she was still getting used to those changed things she relied upon before, such as her decisiveness in issues surrounding war, and was now perturbed to think that her mind did not operate in the same way as it had once done. But that was something to consider in the future. Now, her king was calling on Osrith to be his delegation in Cester, at a critical point where many Norse were invading the country. She was needed. Her mind worked on, and knew what she had to do. Osrith opened her mouth to speak, just as a ripple of some sort passed between Constantine and Owain, and back to Senedd. Though she had no idea what. She turned, and looked just above the future king of Strathclyde's eyes, a trick she had learned that meant he thought she was looking directly at him, but in fact it was a ploy to help her concentrate. "If I may, Lord King?" Deferring to Constantine was a good move, she considered. Just as he was in the process of nodding, Osrith continued. "My being out of the arena of war for some time, I still think of you as the stripling who came back to his homeland. You are a grown man now, with the desire to honor your father, the king of Strathclyde, and your kin, our kin," she added, making sure everyone in the hall heard. "What would Urien think if I did not fulfill a kinsman's desire, bring honor to his land?" Osrith took a few steps forward until she was much closer to the young man. He had grown to the height his father, and she had to look further up than she had imagined. "Prince Owain, it is I who am honored." The hush descended again, the few snatched comments from the warriors falling to nothing, for King Constantine was now standing between them. "Then, it is settled." He looked between Owain and Osrith, before resting his eyes on her face. "You will leave tonight with my delegation for the Lady Ethelfled." "Tonight?" Osrith breathed, and her heart beat faster, her thoughts immediately falling to young Finan. And a second thought told her not to betray what it was about to tell her onto her features, but the king was probably testing her reaction at the prospect of leaving her son. "I may speak to you, Lord King?" Osrith told him. But it was not for this matter, or at least, a different matter for young Finan. When the court had been dismissed and Senedd had closed the throne room doors behind himself, Osrith looked at Constantine gravely. "I cannot take Finan Beeg," she told him. "He cannot come with me," and Constantine raised a hand and took a few steps towards her, though not as close as he usually might. He was taking her betrothal to Senedd seriously, then, Osrith mused, and suddenly yearning for the closeness they once had. "He will stay here, of course," Constantine assured her. "Dunnottar is his home as far as I am concerned. He has no other, until he goes with you and Senedd, to Berwick." He watched as relief shone on her face. "Thank you, Constantine," Osrith told him, then put out a hand. Constantine took a moment before taking it, holding it gently, not pulling her close, not trying to feel for her body. "Tell me," she added, "what am I there for, in Mercia with Ethelfled? What intelligence do you need?" "As much as you can give me." "In reality, you are honoring our tripartite agreement." But Aethelstan, through his father and his aunt, grows in ambition, and I can foresee a time when I, or Selark, or Malcolm, will have to defend Alba from incursions, from acquisition. And those people we rely on as allies now may not be the same people we rely on in the future. Other allegances hold, he added. And Osrith agreed, to Constantine then, and in her own mind as she rode off with the 4 warriors towards the east, through Dyfnwel's land, to track down through Caeligwylid and south towards the Merse. Young Finan had cried when she had told him she was leaving to fight a battle, but at the end of it, holding Edra's hand, her son had stood silently. She had kissed and loved him, and had turned to wave before focusing on the road ahead of her, refusing to turn back again to wave, for she did not trust that she would not abandon her errant mount and run back towards the boy. He lived there now, this was his home, all he knew. And what Osrith was doing, whatever it would end up being, paid for his keep. It was a business transaction after all. But it did not stop Osrith feel a lurch of sadness in her stomach, which she held as they passed the low hills near Scone, and which Eswi had noticed, prompting him to ride closer to her. "Do you feel unwell, Osrith?" he asked. Osrith turned to her friend and smiled, though not an enthusiastic smile, merely a functional one. "Thank you for asking, Eswi," she told him. "I am not." "Ride with me further up the track," he told her, and she drove her horse after his a little way on. "Now tell me," he asked her. I feel different to before I birthed young Finan," she told him. "I cannot rely on my body anymore, nor my thoughts. What I was used to, what was me, is no more." "I see no difference," Eswi told her. "You are Osrith, the Gaelish warrior, you have done many brave, many mighty things, and you will do so again. This is your first campaign since young Finan was born. It's bound to feel strange if you are out of practice." He leaned across in the saddle and added, in a low voice, "You will remember how to be a warrior quicker than you realize." And with that, Osrith turned her head, then gave the signal for Eswi to slow his horse to her pace to let Phelim and Angus and Owain catch up with them. And that was about. Owain asked. Osrith turned, ready to berate him, as an officer would to her rank and file. Then she realized Owain probably did not know how to be, as a warrior, as a novice. It would be up to her to teach him. "Only that we wish to reach your father's kingdom tonight," Osrith told him, then glanced at Phelim and Angus, her look telling them that she was in charge once more. "Then what are we waiting for?" Angus asked her, and all five of them accelerated to a gallop as they passed across Constantine's fields, the evening sun lighting their way west. 88,888,888. 3 days later, and Osrith's party, who had travelled the road out from Caeligwylid unharassed by either Northumbrian, Mercian or Norseman, were met about a mile from Cester by a tall young man on horseback, flanked behind by 3 other warriors. When he called for their leader, Osrith rode forward, watching the man's dark hair that fell in waves to his shoulders, pale grey eyes searching her face, and she fought her mind to think why the man was so familiar to her. It was only when she saw Aldhelm that she knew it was Aethelstan, who did not smile, but acknowledged Osrith with careful respect, and told her, when she had told him she had been sent by Constantine to honor the tripartite agreement that stood between him and Ethelfled, that his aunt had not yet arrived at the city. They rode to the city, Osrith introducing Owain to Aethelstan, whom he acknowledged with the same rigid formality as he had done Osrith. But at that moment, she didn't feel she could care about Aethelstan's manner, for to her right were her Gaelish and Pictish warriors, with one Strathclydian prince to her left were Elfrith and Miral, her dearest Mercian comrades, Aldhelm, Ethelfled's loyal man, riding next to Aethelstan, giving short glances behind him and then low-volumed words to Ethelfled's nephew. Long gone were the days when Aethliad, Ethelfled's husband and previous lord of Mercia, had ordered him to Saltwick to murder his wife. Osrith had ridden after him to prevent him from carrying out his master's orders, which Aldhelm had no intention of following. Osrith had found, and under the gateway to the city itself they passed, allowing the first 2 horses carrying Aldhelm and Aethelstan to pass unhindered, but bunching tightly to funnel the warriors, even Miral and Elfrith, into single file. It was soon to be clear why. "Miral and I can handle the horses," Elfrith told Osrith and her men. "You should come to help," he added, addressing Osrith, and resting untrusted eyes onto Phelim, Angus and Owain. "Come with me," Aethelstan urged. "Your captain can join you in due course." Osrith didn't watch as they trooped towards the city's hall, a 3-story affair guarded heavily, just further up Cester's main street. It was too much to ask her Mercian warriors to find natural fraternity with the warriors of the north. They had fought together once, against the common enemy, crying out in unity for the greatest whore in Christendom, and they would do again. for the Norse were to be stopped flooding into the east of Northumbria. Too many of their number, and they could begin to take cities on sheer strength of number, so they would be comrades again, Osith considered, as she hurried to the stables with her one-time captains, who she had soon outranked. Firm friends, rather, Osrith told herself. Even after 4 years, neither looked much different, although Elfrith was greying at the temples and Miral seemed to have more wrinkles than she remembered. How she must have changed to them, though, and she was glad when Miral had got the horses in, and bolted the door behind them. There has been a conflict with Norse just outside Momkista, Elfrith told her, after greetings had been exchanged. Big claps on the back, and hugs from Osrith, because big claps on the back for 20 years of serving side by side was unthinkable. Ethelfled feels their number means that we are on the back foot. He glanced towards the stable door as some of the travel-weary horses snorted. We don't have long. As emissary for the King of Alba, you will be required at the hall, and we should take you promptly. Elfrith glanced to the door, squinting his eyes as he peered through the crack, before turning back to Osrith. You are to help us quell the incursions of the Norse from Dublin. We four are meant to match the Norse? Osrith asked. Constantine sent us only, not an army.